And we are going to the debunk with our buddy Ben Burgis, author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. He's also got a very, very good Patreon page, which everybody should subscribe to. And in this debunk, we are talking about exploitation, the labor theory of value. We're getting into some really smart and interesting economic and Marxist weeds here. Ben, are you ready for your song?
Yes.
I want to go to Moscow.
Yes.
I will.
So please go.
Okay.
You got to restrain me.
Debunk all of it.
Logical analysis. You're going to show us how to argue that. Go.
This is based on data from a bunch of different countries. There's abundant evidence that at this point that's bullshit. Breaking down these right-wing arguments and looking at how they're supposed to fit together.
Okay, break it down. Break it down. Break it down. Break it down. This is based on data. Ben Burgis, thanks for being here. As always, the weekly debunk in a powerful new sound system. So let's start with, we actually have a clip. This is very apropos because Bree was just on the show. This is from episode 12 of Hear the Burn with another member of the crew, Bhaskar Sunkara, the founder of Jacobin. Check this out.
I'm a capitalist. Let's, in this hypothetical.
I thought you were about to make a self-proclamation there and like break that on this podcast, and I was really excited.
No, I feel like my Twitter following would have some thoughts and feelings about that. But let's say that I've got a bunch of wood. I'm in the business of making tables, okay? You are a laborer. You're a worker. I have $10 worth of wood products. Because I have capital for reasons historically, maybe I colonized someone, who knows, but I have capital. So I have $10 worth of wood and I say to you, can you make this into a table?
Okay, I just wanted to confirm that music was coming from the actual clip, okay.
You are able to do so. You fashioned this table for me and now I'm able to sell it to Bianca for $20. There's $10 worth of profit there. You made those $10 worth of profit. I provided $10 worth of materials. You provided $10 worth of profit through the work of your labor, and now I'm selling it to Bianca for 20 bucks. Now, for me to recoup my investment, I have to take $10, right? And for me to make any profit at all, I've got to take some of the profit that you put into this table, right? You put in $10, but you can't get $10 back, or I don't have any incentive to do this, right? The issue isn't that we should incentivize people to make tables, but imagine if you had an ownership stake in my business, so that all of the profit that I make, some of it goes back to you as well. So the question isn't, should the government own my business? Should the government take the wood and make you work for the government? The question is, should the people who are laboring, people who are working and actually generating the profit in this country, generating all of the goods that make America actually great, should they get a bigger share of the pie instead of me saying, you're poor. You would take $1. You would take 50 cents. You would take 25 cents, right? That's the squeeze we're trying to stop.
Right. Ben, what is this squeeze that we're trying to stop?
Yeah, so what she just laid out there is the basic theory of exploitation that you get in Marxism, and she's laid it out in a very common sense, very easy to understand way, and explaining that even though, of course, the Bernie Sanders campaign isn't advocating, well, going as far in the direction of democratizing the economy as you or I might advocate, they do want to limit the sort of squeeze put on workers in terms of extracting as much as possible of this value that they're creating. That, the capitalists, people who own businesses in the current system, have this built-in incentive to try to squeeze out as much as possible of the revenue of a company to wages plus profits to keep in the form of profits instead of having to give back in the form of wages. And so she's talking about trying to limit that squeeze with the kinds of things that Bernie is advocating. We could talk about, visions for, the kind of thing that your guest last week, talk about for a society where we might put an end to the squeeze entirely.
Right.
But the sort of fundamental thought there is that this is basically unreasonable, that it's not that the boss has generously given you a job as a worker. It's that as a worker, you're generating the value that they're then taking a big slice of as profits, right? So it's really turning upside down the way that we normally think about this stuff, or certainly that we're normally encouraged to think about this stuff. And you could actually, going back to Richard Wolff, you could put an even sharper point on what Brianne Joy Gray is saying there by saying, okay, well, all right, you might say the capitalist has provided the wood, but generally speaking, the actual owner of the enterprise wasn't out there chopping down wood. The capitalist is essentially a middleman between two groups of workers, right? One who collected whatever raw materials you're talking about, and then one who's, another group that's turning it into whatever products that you're selling. And so this all sounds pretty, like, laid out in this way, this all seems straightforward. This just seems obvious. Like, okay, once you've seen the point, you can't unsee it.
Right.
But of course, there are all of these right-wing economists, conservatives and libertarians who have a bunch of objections to this. And we're just going to, given the limited time, of course, we have for this segment, we're just going to talk about one of them right now. So this comes from a guy named Stephen Horowitz at the Foundation for Economic Education.
This is why people saw me smirk when I picked up my copy of this. I am familiar with FEE for a myriad of unhelpful economic ideas. Go ahead.
Yeah. So if you take a look at this, could just look at a couple of lines just to get the flavor of this. He starts out by talking with this analogy to education. He says, why are so many students convinced that they should receive better grades for papers they've spent so much time writing? It's not a belief about the quality of those papers. It's a belief about the hours and hours spent working on them. This fundamental misunderstanding about the value of labor is at the center of the Marxist critique of capitalism. And then he goes on to explain that this is something called the labor theory of value, that says that that the value of a product, a commodity, is a function of labor time. If you actually read Marx, it's a little bit more complicated than what he's portrayed it as being here. That Marx would say that exchange value is this kind of abstract average labor time, and the price of a commodity isn't the same as its exchange value. The exchange value is this underlying thing that the price reflects, but the price is also subject to all kinds of fluctuations because of things like supply and demand. But the key point is that this guy is saying that that Marx's critique of capitalism is based on the labor theory of value. So if you scroll down, he says that all right, this is another quote from the article. For Marx, the theory was at the center of his view of the problems of capitalism. The argument that capitalism exploited workers, what we just heard Brianne Joy Gray explain, depended crucially on the view that labor was the source of all value, and that the profits of capitalists were therefore, quote, taken, unquote, from workers who deserved it. And so what his claim is going to be here is that the labor theory of value is rejected by most contemporary academic economists. That's true. And therefore, it's this like old refuted economic idea. And once you reject that, you also have to reject Marx's idea that workers are being exploited by capitalists. And as far as the actual like technical economic details of this, I will say that there are contemporary figures who do actually have really sophisticated, really interesting defenses of the labor theory of value, like our mutual friend and mutual editor Doug Lane would be very upset if I didn't mention Andrew Kleiman here, who has a book called Reclaiming Marx's Capital, where he defends the labor theory of value against the sort of technical critique of it that's been made of by a lot of economists. But I think there's a larger point here that you don't have to be able to follow mathematically complicated economic arguments to understand.
Right.
And that's really what I want to focus in on here, which is that whatever's true about the source of economic value. So you could agree with Marx, who says that ultimately it's a function of labor time. By the way, that's not just Marx. That's also Adam Smith. That's also Ricardo. Like early capitalist economics also was based on this idea that it kind of became associated with the left and they ran away from it. But it could, that could be the right theory. Or for the sake of argument, you could go with the kind of theory that you get in most contemporary mainstream economics, which says that no, it's not. It has nothing to do with labor time. This is just a confusion on the same level as thinking that your grade on a paper should be a function of how long it took you to write it. Really, it's just about the subjective preferences of consumers, and that's all that dictates value. But taking a long step back from all of this, whatever is true about all of that, Marx's point about exploitation would actually still hold up. So the key point here is made by someone named G.A. Cohen, who is a 20th century Marxist analytic philosopher, somebody I'd strongly recommend people check out his work. He's got a great book called Karl Marx's Theory of History. He's got another great one critiquing libertarianism called Self-Ownership, Freedom, and Equality. And G.A. Cohen's point that he makes here is it doesn't actually matter what's true about the theory of value in terms of Marx's point about exploitation, because the way to see Cohen's point is to think about an analogy to a non-capitalist form of exploitation. Before capitalism, you had feudalism, where peasants mostly produced goods. Well, peasants produced goods partially for their own use, and then partially they had feudal obligations to give up some of the goods they were producing to their feudal lord. And we can all see that that's a kind of exploitation, that's a case where the peasants are producing something that's been taken away from them. Well, Cohen's point is that capitalist production is going to mirror that, no matter what's true about this technical economic question about value, that regardless of what's true about that, the goods and services sold by a company are still going to be produced by workers, that nature is going to play some role there, but the only human beings who play any role in creating them are workers. And so they're still the source of the goods that have that value, right? They're still producing the commodities that have value. So, whatever is true about why the value of the commodity is what it is, it's still the case that this is value of something that's been created by workers. And so if you accept that this is a kind of structural thing where most people don't really have a choice but to work for capitalists, so that it's not really a voluntary exchange, then you still have to accept that the point about the wood and the value of the table and all of that is still going to hold up, because it's still going to be true that this is value of things produced by workers. And so if the workers have a right to the goods, the workers have a right to the value of the goods. And so
this is just to put a button on it in just a minute, because we do have to jump in a minute. But in Silicon Valley, a lot of the rhetoric, the irony at this point, obviously, that the Silicon Valley economy for both the really privileged exploited workers as well as the just ruthlessly downtrodden, like, Uber drivers. The reality is that, you're working all the time. That is the mode of production.
Mm-hmm.
However, there was a rhetoric, probably more so several years ago, when there was kind of like an emphasis on idealizing these actually totalitarian work environments, if I could just editorialize. Yeah. But it was like, no, it doesn't, you're going to get, as an example, freelancers, and some people prefer to work this way for very understandable reasons if you can work it right. But like, you're going to get paid per deliverable. So give me this thing. I don't care. If you're getting paid 20 grand for something you took an afternoon on, great for you. That's awesome. You could also get paid, 20 grand for something you took 3 months on. Less awesome. But it doesn't matter to me as the person profiting off of it what the time was, but obviously there's still an extraction of value. And that is the core point here. And I think that this is lost to history, and I wouldn't dig it up anyways. But when I took capital in college, I wrote an undergrad paper called, I think it was something like Marx in the Valley or something like that. Yeah. And it was all about why, like, Silicon Valley tech talk doesn't negate what I had just been reading in Capital. And in fact, first it was that it was a new commons enclosure by privatizing the digital commons. And that secondly, exploitation still stood, even if people weren't on a factory floor. They were still, basically, they were having profit wrung out of their ideas, basically.
Well, this is a really simple way of seeing the point that for any of these things, right, whether you're talking about Uber drivers or, people, to use a really annoying word, creatives, or people in any of these roles, that, whether it's in traditional factory setting, whether it's in Silicon Valley, whatever, if you just imagine that the bosses just disappear, the owners of these companies just disappeared tomorrow, right? Like they were all just beamed up to alien spaceships, or, they were raptured up, or they went to Galt's Gulch or whatever. Then the company, the actual functioning of the company would be unaffected by that. Right. Like it could still carry on just fine as a workers' cooperative. There's plenty of.
Well, that goes back to, though, but then that's where all of the stuff like the myth of the genius and the sort of cult of leadership, cultural stories come in.
Oh, yeah, no, totally. But which of course are the stories that all of these guys like to tell about themselves, that the media loves to tell them. But if we look at the success and productivity of cooperatively owned companies around the world, then could see that that's just not true, right? The companies could carry on just fine without them. Whereas if the workforce disappeared, then it wouldn't work, right? Nobody would be driving the cars in the Uber case, nobody would be making the tables in the original case that we started with. And you would have nothing, you wouldn't have the goods or services that are being sold, and therefore you wouldn't have the value of those goods and services. So whenever you run into somebody saying, well, actually, if you understood economics, you would know that, they're not really being exploited, then that person actually doesn't understand the structure of the argument, that whatever's true about the first part, the second part still stands.
Ben Burgis, indispensable as always, author of the essential book, Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, and a great Patreon page. We'll link to all of it. Ben, thank you so much as always, brother.
All right. Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Love hearing Ben on that microphone. Get those bass tones.
Ben is loud and clear. You want to take the sound down? I'll call into the system. You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there, subscribe below.